Okay, welcome everyone. And this is our very first episode of the IMA podcast, the Independent Media Association's podcast. In this podcast, we will discuss the state of play in the media right now and what we can do about it. And who best to have on as our first guest than Tom Barlow, the chair of the Independent Media Association. Hi, Tom.
Hello.
And he's going to lay out what is going on with the established media, the independent media, and talk about the efforts to change the fortunes of both and what we can do to change the state of the media. So let's start with a bit of an overview of the current landscape. So can you tell us a bit more where the mainstream media is at, and why has it become essential to set up something like the Independent Media Association?
Yeah, when we talk about the state of the media, then obviously most people think about what we call the establishment media, the big media, as it were. And just by the way, I want to apologise in advance to listeners and viewers. You will get bigger and more salubrious guests in the future. But to begin with, hopefully what I can do is give you an overview of as you say, why we've set this up and what it does. And when I start talking about the establishment media, it's pretty bleak. But don't worry, because at the end of the podcast, we're going to be talking about what we can do to change it. And that is, whenever you're listening or watching to this, it could be years in the future. I still think the lessons of what we do about it will be universal and ongoing, even though there'll be some specifics. But yeah, let's talk about the state of play. So we're going to be using rule of three quite a lot today. We've been talking what's the state of the establishment media, the independent media, and what we're going to do. But let's talk about the establishment media and the three key sort of institutions that make up the establishment media. So we've got the broadcast media, we've got the press, we've got the new player, big tech. And, a lot of people still haven't kind of got into the idea that Facebook, Google, and Twitter, who variously own a lot of other platforms, are news providers and probably should be regulated as such. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a tick, but they are part of the picture now, very firmly part of it. And there's been some recent developments that I find fascinating. But in brief, this is what the overview looks like. The BBC, which represents about 80% of broadcast news in the UK, is underfunded. It's controlled and populated by the government and government employees or associates and former billionaire press employees, and is savagely attacked by the national press for being too left-wing, whilst being pretty much the most effective establishment pro-government broadcaster in the UK. So it's in this very weird bind, and we find ourselves at a point where almost no one on any side of the political spectrum can see a justification for the licence fee, partially because of what the Conservative government have done to it over the past decade or so, and partially because of its blatant bias against the Corbyn leadership, and because of the attacks by the national press, who want to see more space so they can set up their own TV broadcasters, especially Rupert Murdoch. He wants to have a Fox News UK. And when 80% of broadcast news is represented by the BBC, he recognises there isn't enough space in the market for his sort of, quite frankly, far-right broadcaster to actually be financially successful. So he's creating a reason for it by attacking it constantly through his tabloids. As do the Mail and the other sort of right-wing press. So that's the state of the broadcast press. Briefly, the national press, over 70%, or around about 70% of it is owned by three billionaire families who avoid regulation at all costs. They constantly publish pro-elite narratives. They maintain order for their billionaire owners and multinational corporations who fund them through their advertising. And they do this through spreading, quite frankly, massive disinformation and divide and rule stories. And again, I'm not just saying this because I dislike them. My opinion on them is relatively neutral insofar as they just exist. This is what they do. That's backed up by a lot of research, and even a cursory look at any paper any day will give you an idea of what kind of agenda they're pushing. And it is they are always acting in the interests of their owners and the people who fund them, which is the multinational corporations. it's worth noting about this as well, though, we can be positive about it, because despite all of this money put in by tax dodging billionaires and all these multinational corporations who keep these failing businesses alive, who have 70% of the distribution in the UK, they still cannot get more than maybe around about 25 to 30% of the population to vote for the parties electorally that they support, which is usually the Conservative Party, or obviously the Blair government when that was in power. So they can't actually get the majority of the populace to agree with them, but they can get enough to work the electoral system. But it shows that even with this massive effort, they don't create as much influence for the billionaires and the elite as they would like. And the third part is big tech. And whilst some reports like the Hope Not Hate report on the state of hate has identified YouTube as a grooming ground for Nazis, and as Twitter have recognized, they've had to ban a lot of far-right ideologues off their platform, and Facebook and Google have been doing similar things. Ultimately, actually, the bans that have come most often into effect have been around general elections, especially general election 2019, where it's not just been bans, but it's also been algorithmic dampening, i.e. you can't reach as much of your audience as you like. You might have 100,000 people like your page, but if only 1,000 of them are seeing what you post on Facebook, because Facebook has deemed your page as politically not within the parameters that they like, then independent media has been suffering because of that, and actually very truthful, factually accurate, useful information has been stopped from getting to the public by Facebook because and Google and Twitter, because they don't want to be regulated. They don't want to be regulated by government. They don't want to be recognized as media.
Your phone's in flight mode, so I can't help you with that at the moment.
Wow. We're spied upon all the time.
There we
You
go.
couldn't have timed this better.
Google listening to me.
Big tech.
Trying to fuck up my day, right? So, yeah, look, they're utilizing. They're saying we're doing stuff about the far right. They attack, quite frankly, independent and small media outlets the most, and as we'll talk about maybe a little bit later, Facebook are looking to depoliticize it in total, because news and politics create some of the most problems and generate some of the least income. So they'll do big deals, as Google has done in Australia just recently, and Facebook, with the big establishment billionaire media organizations that are in that country, and then sod off and crush everyone else, just get rid of everyone else. And it's crazy because they've created the problem by incentivizing cheap false media, like conspiracy theorists, the alt-right, and viral posts that are based on eliciting extreme emotion, right? Like you create posts that make people really angry, so they share it, right? They created that through their algorithms, and because they refuse to pay for, they're making all this money from advertising, which is not going to content producers. So they've incentivized this atmosphere where we get just loads of false information about the world. And then what they do is they go, well, we don't want to be regulated and treated like proper media, so what we'll do is we'll just crush any independent media, and we'll deal with actually the establishment media platforms, which are actually as greater purveyors of disinformation, as we can see with Fox News or even the Daily Mail, that has huge amounts of official complaints about its what it publishes, and that's how they get away with it. They're just trying to say, well, look, we don't want to actually have to take any responsibility for the fact that if we are considered a news provider, then we're also then we are obligated to make sure that people are receiving truthful, factually accurate information about the world, instead of lies, disinformation, and distortion. So that's the state of the media at the moment. And like I say, there's some more details, but ultimately we've got crushed BBC, an ever-growing and powerful establishment press that is now getting money from big tech because they don't want to be regulated, and that's how it's going. And into that, those establishment media types are producing 2 news channels in the UK, UK News TV and GB News, one backed by Rupert Murdoch, who's obviously a very famous billionaire owner. And they are looking to Foxify Britain and to,
I was going to ask you actually why the timing of the founding, I guess, of the IMA is particularly prescient at the moment in terms of those new channels that are being created. So I wanted to see whether that had played a part in the momentum behind the IMA.
It's certainly been in the discussions when we talk about how there's been several coalescing factors. I mean, one of the things is that now that the Corbyn project within the UK has failed and is not going to electorally, deliver, then a lot of media reform that I think a lot of people were hoping for, relying on, that would actually, protect independent media and help the growth of truthful and factually accurate media in the UK, is out the window. So people have had to, organizations in this space have had to start going, well, we need a solution actually now that doesn't rely on the government or some savior coming down the line, because it's not going to happen. It's going to have to be us. That's one of the key things. The other key thing is there's been discussion about the online harms bill that the government are looking to pass that might be a positive thing in terms of text journalists. But again, what we're seeing is that Twitter and big tech are going to be regulated in terms of not allowing hate speech and aggressive, abusive behavior on their platforms. But the Daily Mail and the Sun, whose forums have an extreme amount of this, are not going to be regulated by the same thing. So again, we can see that, this can aid the establishment press in this country. But yes, the discussions in GB News and UK News TV, which had started last autumn, did really put a rocket up everyone's bum, because basically, especially after what we saw at the Capitol building in the US, we know that Fox got a president like Trump elected, who, to be fair to him, policy-wise, is not really considerably worse than any American president before him. But his attitude towards the truth and the media was particularly damaging, and also his support of far-right fascists and the political cover he gave them enabled a potential far-right coup in his country. Now, in America, the print media is largely liberal, not left-wing, but liberal. Whereas in this country, the print media is largely right-wing to far-right.
Yeah.
And so what it means is if you get TV stations like Fox to add to that already very vitriolic media space that is divisive, aggressive, conspiratorial, spreads disinformation about COVID, is a danger to public health, we could see very quickly, within 3-4 years of these stations being here, attempted coups in this country. And certainly an increase in far-right fascist activity. Plus also, again, with those organizations becoming really politically important, the elected officials, the politicians in power, more and more defer to them and let them set the agenda on what needs to be done. And when it comes to media, that means crushing all their opponents. So not giving access, not giving space to independent media, not giving access or space to media that tells truth to power. Because what Fox and that style of media does, they like to be deferential to power, deferential to the existing elite. And if that elite might on the surface seem different to their attitudes, you might get Democrats or Labour like Keir Starmer, who are essentially economically the same. They'll pretend to be vehemently against them, but will support those policies that keep their owners rich and their funders rich and keep us divided. And that's a very dangerous state for our country to be in one of the most important decades in human history, because we've really got 10 years to tackle the climate crisis. And amongst all other things that we've got to challenge, we've really got to deal with this now. And if we have an explosion in climate denial, divide and rule, disinformation, due to stations like this, we're as a species in a really bad place.
So we're going to get on to the role of independent media. Well, first of all, the state the landscape, I guess, of independent media and go through what's out there at the moment and the state it's in. But just before we touch onto that, I just wanted to ask you about the BBC. So this kind of very peculiar position it finds itself in, and what can be done about that, because ultimately it's a state broadcaster, and I would be inclined to think that most countries, if not every country, should have a state broadcaster which is publicly funded, which is accountable to the public, which is, has to toe the fine line between being funded and by the government, but also be editorially independent and fair and accurate and so on. So I would argue that we probably need something like the BBC. So what can it be rescued? Can things be done, steps put in place in order to, I guess, to prevent it from just being completely commodified, or just dying altogether if then the license fee is revoked and then it can't possibly function without any funding anymore?
Well, I think they will not be revoked, probably, and I think there'll always be a space for it. For the government, when the BBC was founded, as Tom Mills charts in his book, "The Myth of the Public Service," it was set up as a state broadcaster, and I think you used the right term there. It is a state broadcaster. Now, when we think about Russia Today or Al Jazeera or anything like that, we recognize it for what it is. It is a propagandist organization of the state. And the BBC, as I think John Peel just said, is the most refined propagandist in the world. Like, what's amazing about the BBC is people trust it, especially around the world, more so than maybe here. But again, here, the levels of trust for it against other media are pretty high. So it has utility to the government. But the government also, especially conservative government, but pretty much any government, can make a lot of a political capital for themselves by appearing to be opposed to it. Of course, at some point, that means you are going to have to make a change. And what they were doing over the past decade is they top sliced it to pieces. So they took away, at least 20% of its funding, maybe considerably more, depending on the way that you look at it. And that's in the order of billions per year. And you have to see that Sky News produces, for instance, £6 billion a year, and the BBC about 4, the whole BBC about 4. And Sky News is a paid-for platform with advertising, and really only produces football and news. It doesn't really, some sports. It doesn't really, and you have to pay extra for those packages. In comparison, the BBC is actually a pretty good service because it's a universal service. It provides all the radio stations, the website, the online services. There is value to that public commodity. Now, if the government gets its way, it will probably go down the route of cutting the environmental department, the cultural department, the stuff that produces dramas, because they find them distasteful, and they find social liberalism where there is, say, a mixture of ethnicities and genders and sexualities represented. They find that distasteful. It's also, again, an easy stick to beat, and it satisfies the right-wing press who want to attack it. They probably won't withdraw a lot of funding from the news department, because the news department has essentially become a spokesperson for the government. In the past couple of years, the past 2 years, and really since the Johnson government, its role as an independent news organisation has now become laughably obscure. Like there isn't that pretense any longer that they are going to interrogate the Conservative government or the government of the day. Again, this may be true for Keir Starmer if he ever got in. They're not going to interrogate them. They are a state broadcaster. They are there to present the views of the state, not to interrogate them. So what can be done about the BBC? Well, first off, it shouldn't be a state broadcaster. It should be a public broadcaster. And that means decoupling it, taking it away from being funded by the state. We pay for it, but through an independent body, through a separate body that doesn't. So the BBC cannot be negotiating every 5 and 10 years with the government for its money, because we've seen what happens. It gets cut. It doesn't really have any choice. Even
then it has to toe the line. basically,
It has to
in order to
toe
get
the line.
funding.
And we know, like, look, during Blair's government, he got rid of the Director General Greg Dyke because of his opposition to the war in Iraq. Like, again, it's not a left-right thing, it's a government thing. Will it hold the government to account? No. If the government's allies are largely big business or the powerful in other arenas, which it almost always is, will it hold them to account? No. So it doesn't, as a news organization, tell truth to power, and so therefore is merely a spokesperson for the powerful. We have to take that funding element away. We have to democratize it. If we look at the three key positions within the BBC, there's the Ofcom, which regulates the BBC, is about to be taken over by Paul Dacre, the former editor of the Daily Mail, who Brian Cathcart listed 10 reasons why he's not fit for the job. I won't read them all, but let me just read out my three favorites. He's a 20-year record of repeatedly breaching regulatory codes and failing to improve his conduct in response to regulatory action, i.e. he gets caught breaking the rules and doesn't do anything about it. 20 years of record, and Brian Cathcart is a professor in media. He's really worth trusting on this. He has repeatedly published misinformation on an important medical matter affecting the lives of millions of children. That's really worth looking into. He's really endangered public health through his lies. When Brian Cathcart says misinformation, what we're talking about here is he's lied to the public about health matters that have affected millions of children. And he has limited respect for or understanding of the rule of law. And again, that's a professor's way of saying he breaks the law regularly. This is the guy who's going to take over the regulation of the BBC. We have Richard Sharp has been appointed the chair of the board of directors. He donated £400,000 to the BBC, to the Conservative Party. He's donated £400,000 to the Conservative Party, and has spent 23 years at Goldman Sachs. This is the guy. What does he know about broadcasting? Nothing. He's just paid the right people and knows the right people. And then you have Tim Davie, who's another ex-Conservative minister high up in the Conservative Party, who's the Director General. Now, these are the three most important positions. They are clearly going to act in the interests of the elite and the establishment. We have to have a democratic organisation. We have to have a democratic BBC. If we were voting for who's Director General, who was head of Ofcom and so forth, I think even with a vitriolic right-wing hatred of the BBC, then maybe you would get a right-winger in charge, but probably one that actually knows something about the job. And probably if you were electing the board, they would be constrained by a board that would represent the views of the populace. So I think the BBC has to be democratised, as well as decoupled in that licence fee fashion. And I think the money that it gets in as well should be distributed in an Arts Council style way to independent media providers. I think its news budget should be slashed by like a third, and that would free up maybe £300 million a year that could go into independent journalism, public interest journalism, and that could be any journalism that is regulated by the NUJ, National Union of Journalists Code of Conduct, or any journalism regulated by Impress, which is the only Leveson standard regulator, right? So then you could make sure it's going to good stuff, and you could even encourage public votes. But those are the things I'd do. Decouple it from the state, democratise it, and give some of the money to public and public interest journalism, so it's not on the BBC solely to hold the government to account. And let's just there was a lot of sort of regulatory words and all of this kind of stuff, but let's say what it is. The BBC is a captured, state-controlled institution. It acts in the interests of the elite. We have to put it back in public hands, or put it in public hands for the first time, because it's never been in public hands.
No, but it had, I guess, there's been a significant change in terms of its remit and in terms of its I guess it's an investigative journalism output. So we were talking the other day, I remember us mentioning World in Action, of course. So programs like those that were frankly quite brave, but we don't really see them being made these days. And that's, I think you're right, they're going to be the first victims of the cuts, of any cuts in funding. We're not going to see those kinds of programs anymore. Just before we move on to independent media, I just want to ask, is the IMA addressing those concerns? is there any sort of campaigning or anything being put out there to gain support and raise awareness about those issues and what can be done to address the state of the BBC?
Yeah, well, I mean, the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists, and BEC2, which is the other union that represents most BBC workers, certainly within journalism, have run campaigns around Love It or Lose It and stuff like that. We're getting to a point where the public support isn't enough for the BBC to protect it from being absolutely savaged by the government. And already you've seen Victoria Derbyshire's show go, you've seen massive cuts to the environmental department, and which was a world leader, and a bunch of other things besides. What the Media Reform Coalition is doing over the coming year is doing a sort of public consultation, a series of town halls around the country, which will mostly be online because of the current situation, to develop a sort of people's manifesto for what the BBC should look like. And they want to build up huge public pressure for the midway license review, which is at some point in 2022, so that's some point next year. There's going to be a midway license review, and the government could do a lot of damage there, and there needs to be, and there hasn't been, a public campaign around the BBC. And the Media Reform Coalition, who are partners of the IMA, are going to be running that. We're going to be supporting it and being involved in it, and hopefully our media partners will pick that up, and hopefully they watch this and go, do you know what, this is an important thing that we need to discuss, because it represents, as I say, such a huge part of broadcast media, news media in the UK, that we can't just let it wither and die, because we're not ready to fill the gap. And it's one of the only bulwarks against private ownership of the news media, which we know is, quite frankly, if anything, worse, which is a sad state of affairs. Even though we think, I think it'd be fair to say that the BBC is devastatingly on the side of the establishment and the powerful. It in fact can get worse, and we really need to reform this institution rather than just letting it collapse.
And as a tool, it can be harnessed to produce and promote fair, accurate, balanced news. So that's why it would be a shame to lose that. Moving on to independent media, could you give us a bit of an idea of what's out there and what's being done at the moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, independent media, hopefully everyone here knows what it is, but we had to, at the Media Fund, which is the predecessor organisation to the Independent Media Association, we had to come up with a sort of definition for it. And we say that it's independently financed, but that it's also trustworthy. So it is either regulated by Impress, or all members are part of the NUJ and regulated by its Code of Conduct and its Ethics Council. What we're trying to say is that you can have independent media that is trustworthy, factually accurate. It can be partisan as you like. It can be all over the spectrum, and it can be rowdy and aggressive and lowbrow, and it can be academic and highbrow and effete and elitist, right? And it can be everything in between, right? But what it has to be is financially independent, and that means it doesn't take money from the state, and it doesn't take money from multinational corporations. It is not funded by advertising, or the majority of its funding does not come from advertising. With some hyper-locals, you get local businesses, certainly ethical businesses, investing, and we disinclude them in our definition of what independent is. The importance of that financial independence cannot be understated. You have to tell truth to power. The point of journalism is to give us factually accurate information about the world, and we're not going to get that from people who have a vested interest in achieving certain things, in having certain outcomes, i.e. keeping things the same or making them worse, making them better for a tiny minority and for the majority of us worse, right? We have to have stuff that's going to hold those people to account, and those organizations to account. And that's what independent media is about. Now, it's not existed or been defined like that for actually very long in the UK. There are long-running institutions like the New Internationalist, which is 40 years old. And there's zines and magazines, maybe, there's like The Ecologist and a bunch of others. And I'll talk you through all the different types of media. But it's actually quite a recent phenomenon. because the cost of print was so prohibitive. You might have got like zines, anarchist zines, and you might have got like Marxist Leninist, for instance, publications like Socialist Worker. But what you didn't get was, very rarely, there was an attempt in the 80s, you know, fully fledged independent media that was independently financed. Now, the cost of entry on the internet were a lot cheaper. They were a lot cheaper. They're slowly but surely tying that things up. And if you read, what's his name, Adam Smith, he will say that capitalism always tends towards a monopoly. Like, that's what happens. If you study it over time, it will always, every time there's a new market, there is opportunity, but within time, 2 or 3 organizations will take up control of it all. And we've seen that with the internet, right? Like Google, Facebook, they control between them something like 70 or 80% of news advertising revenue on the internet, right? That's 2 organizations that really control almost all the information we get about the world. And that happened over the space of 20 years, less, 15 years. But at the beginning, there was an organization called IndieMedia.org, and it grew up around the anti-globalization movement. It was very much activist media. And, you know, nowadays everyone would look at it and think it's really clunky. And eventually it was, you know, it collapsed because, amongst many other things, it was a volunteerist network, and it was kept together by an anarchistic ideal of volunteerism, that actually, if you bureaucratize things, if you professionalize them, then you don't then they don't represent real people. They actually become this, you know, this class above.
Well, it's mostly the issue that I guess how long for can you run an outlet or an organization or a platform purely through volunteering? At some point, there's going to be the issue of money, especially because a lot of people, and ideally the people that you'd want involved in these endeavors, just don't have the time and means. They have to have independent funding. Do you see what I mean? Either their parents are bankrolling them, or they're sitting on wealth. Somewhere there needs to be, people need to be making, if not a full living, at least their time needs to be monetized in some way. So is that feasible? What's out there? What is independent media currently relying on in terms of funding organizations? Yeah,
well, I mean, just to go back to the indie media stuff, I mean, one of the reasons it's collapsed was because squatting was made illegal. You know, the state was paying for that media. It was because there was a lot of people who were on the dole and living for free in squats, and they maintained things. You know, that ideal cannot be maintained in the world. The Conservatives actually, in making squatting illegal, did one of the favors to independent media that they could have done. It made us slowly but surely get organized. And you see in 2012, 2013, this growth of independent media, new outlets start growing up. They could have started earlier, you know, but there's like, well, we have to do this and we have to have some strategic approach to it. And there's a lot of different types of outlets. But what didn't occur was then a methodical way of getting to audiences or generating income. You know, every platform developed different ways. Everyone was sort of, up until literally this point, has gone, I'm all right, Jack. I've just about worked out how to make my thing. And of course, in that time as well, lots of organizations came and went. The 2 or 3 years would be the top life cycle, because it requires so much volunteerism at the beginning, and you might not make the money. You know, the independent media is still an unrepresentative place of the working class, because the working class can't afford to take years to develop a new media platform. And you know, there's been a certain amount of naivety as well, because they've gone, well, we'll just stick out on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter and people will see it. Like, and most people have only focused on creating the content and very little on how to put it out there and who owns the platforms that you're putting it on. Because they started to get problems, especially around the general election 2019. They started to realize a lot of organizations had their algorithmically, they were even notified by Facebook, said, we're taking you down to 1% of what you had before. And what you had before was that you'd only reach 1 to 3% of your audience. That's all that Facebook would allow you to reach if you put a post. Even if you paid, you would reach 5%. So the independent media has not systemically been thinking about how to deal with those things. Hopefully, at the IMA, we have to, and when we talk about some solutions, there's some solutions in the cards. But mostly, organisations have been going, how can we get this to work? How can we make our thing work for our audience? And sometimes they're not even sure about what their audience is. They're just like, I like making this, I like doing it, and there's been a lot of passion projects, which is great. It's a great thing to do, and to be honest, if you're making something, you should make stuff yourself, because at least one person's happy with what comes out of it. But we're at this point where there's all these institutions, all these organizations, but we're still far smaller than the far right, who are far better organized and funded and far higher levels of production, and obviously absolutely crushed by the establishment media in terms of both our access through big tech, but just like the scale of the national press and the BBC. We're not anywhere close to it. Now, the Canary will tell you that they had a reach of 8 to 12 million during the 2017 general election.
Mm-hmm.
And, even Real Media, an organisation I helped found, had a reach of nearly 2 million. But, there's little openings and they get shut. And we're at that point now where it's all been shut, and we have to change those things, which I'll talk about in a tick, but I'll let you ask another question. And then
I was going to move on to what can be done, because ultimately, when you look at it like this, it's David against Goliath. It seems impossible to tackle the challenge posed by just how powerful mainstream media is. And it's being bankrolled by very rich people, which obviously influences its narrative. And it's a vicious cycle. So I'm not quite sure how, at least the IMA and the independent outlets out there are meant to tackle this. And it did feel, especially with what's happened with the latest elections and the Corbyn project, that any attempt at trying to put forward an alternative narrative can so easily be crushed. But through sheer lies at this point, even, outlets are peddling lies, and there is so little accountability.
Well, I think it's worth noting that the Corbyn project was crushed because it was an electoral project in many respects. The media and the right wing of the Labour Party have nearly a century's worth of experience of crushing the left of the Labour Party. Those projects are doomed to fail, in my personal opinion. I should say that's not necessarily the opinion of the IMA. But what I would say is it's important to make a differentiation. As chair of the IMA, I'd say this would be a fair analysis. There's a differentiation between media and an electoral party and an electoral force. There are institutions to deal with electoral parties, and there are institutions to deal with leaders as well. You can just look at what happened to Corbyn over 4 or 5 years. There's just 4 or 5 years worth of lies, and only 2 of them really stuck. But think about all of the stuff that was stuck at him, because that's what you can do with the leader. Now, if you have a network of many, many different outlets that are producing many, many different kinds of media for many different audiences, we do need to collaborate, and we do need to represent ourselves as the sector and get our elbows out and show that we deserve a seat at the table, to be respected, to be trusted by the public, and to be a force. But also, similarly, because we're quite diffuse, it is harder to attack and destroy. Now, the BIJ told us, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, the other day, told us that there has been a marked increase in lawsuits against independent media and investigative journalists in the past 6 months, which is a unique case of, again, they're going to try and work at attacking us. So one of the things that the IMA is going to coordinate is legal defense. It's something that the big independent media may have an on-hand lawyer or someone that they call. The small ones won't have it all, and very few have any funds to deal with it. I mean, lawsuits are extortionately expensive. Extortionately expensive. And a lot of that can be saved by being regulated by Impress, which will be a lot cheaper and will protect you from nuisance lawsuits and stuff. But getting that legal advice before you put stuff out will help. And if we can collate and get pro bono lawyers to give their types of the network as a whole that every outlet can then access, that would be a good use of the lawyer's time, hopefully, and a coordinated effort to protect ourselves from those attacks. We want to be prepared for what's coming because it's already happening, and we can do that. I think.
Sorry to interrupt. What are these lawsuits usually around? Has it been defamation cases, or what exactly?
I have to get more
How many
details from
grievances?
the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. I'm having a meeting with them later next week to find out more. So I would, it sounds anecdotal, but what the Bureau do is they help work with investigative journalists in localities all around the UK, ones that are working, say, at the Blackburn Post or something like that. And what they're telling me is that it's coming from there. Now, these, that's the kind of thing that can go under the radar and that isn't noticed unless, again, we're working together and talking about it. But to get specifics, I think we should interview Megan Lucero from the BIJ, because I think she would be able to tell us some fascinating stories, and what they're doing is, absolutely stellar. And we're proud to have them as partners of the IMA, and really want to support the work. So, she could give you more details. I can't give you the specifics. What I can tell you is what I've heard anecdotally and what I think we should be prepared to act on. And I talk about this because this podcast is as much to our partners as it is to the public. I want, I do 10-15 hours worth of meetings a week trying to talk to each partner individually, but we have around 40 partners and we hope to have a lot more. So we want to produce something like this so that we can keep people updated. And that brings me on to the three things, coming back to the rule of three, that we are looking to do. We're looking to create shared resources, we're looking to create shared funding opportunities, and we're looking to increase the reach and impact of independent media. So when we talk about shared resources, we talked about legal support, we're talking about video production. We can definitely do better around that. Graphic design, training for journalists, especially new journalists coming into the scene, and we could have shared kits, especially things like microphones and stuff like that we could send to each other, and just kit lists that are good if you're starting out and you want to start a podcast, a vidcast, you want to get voice to speech software, you want to get something that will, you can use AI to help you write and stuff like that. We want to have all the best resources in one place, because then we can help startups and help existing independent media with all of those things. So that's the kind of set of resources we want to create. Around funding, we want to create, we've highlighted sort of 5 key areas that we want to create funding pots in. So we want to create bursaries for new journalists from working class backgrounds to go into independent media. So ideally, funding institutions might be the trade unions, might be grant funders, it might be a big donation drive to the public, right? Say we're going to create these funding pots. And what we want is, we want working class people to be in independent media and in the media generally, because they will tell stories that are important, that are, that will tell truth to power, that will represent, the majority of the public, because the majority of the public are working class, and other disadvantaged backgrounds. But I would suggest most disadvantaged backgrounds are within sort of terminology of the working class. But anyways, that's me. We want to create funds for specialist reporters. A lot of these things have been dying. So we're talking about investigative journalism, but also industrial relations reporting. There isn't reporting on strikes, on workplace actions. There are very few specialists on that in the country. Almost no national paper, and even the BBC, has anyone who reports on these things. They have business editors, but they don't have industrial relations reporters. There are very few specialists in environmental reporting, and there's actually a lot of different ways that we need to talk about the environment to, as I say, highlight, for me, one of the most important, probably the most important issue of the decade, or and there's a lot. and I wouldn't ever want to diminish anything else, but we've really got to rise to this
Yeah.
challenge. So again, let's create specialists, let's get them in independent media, let's get them networked so they can share stories and information that they're getting from investigations they're doing, and make sure it's going out amongst a wide range of outlets. Because again, if you've got an outlet like the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, or maybe let's say Declassified UK, that's a great investigative producer, but that they generally do stuff for maybe more educated, higher reading age readers, well, you might want to get that story in the Canary as well, because they produce for lower reading age readers, things like that. We want to get a fund that expands existing independent media, and we want to get a fund that helps start up new independent media. And we'd also like to see if we can put funding into a counter disinformation service, not something that's constantly rebutting and fact checking every day, but does research into where the sources of disinformation are coming from, what we can do about it, make people aware that this is a problem, a public problem that the public, all of us, need to sort out. So that's what we're trying to do around funding, and these are really important things.
And sorry, what's the strategy for funding? Are you reaching out to organizations, to philanthropists? What can you create on the ground in those terms?
I mean, one of the shared resources we'll have is a map of grant funders and funding institutions that we will go to. But we believe that the trade union leadership and the trade union rank and file, which are separate things, are both, well, we know the trade union leadership are interested in funding independent media. Trade unions in this country may die in the next 20 years if the decrease in union density is so rapid, and the spread of disinformation from the right about trade unionism is so high that we know unions, who also, by the way, are the founders and co-owners of the Labour Party, and have seen that party turn its back once again on them. They're withdrawing their money from that party, and they want to go, well, what's more effective to create social change that benefits the people we represent, which is working people? Well, put it into independent media. We think that there could be some support for that there, and we've heard statements publicly that suggest that the case. And we will also go to rank and file local trade union branches, because we know if even the leadership aren't, we know the rank and file branches are very generous with their time and money, and again, they have stories that need to be told that they can never get into any publications because local media is being savaged and cut to shreds by the three major companies that own them, because it all comes down to threes in the end. Three major companies own the majority of the local media in this country. They offsource all the money into tax havens and all the profits, and they are actually the only profitable news businesses in print, because national papers are not. But they're taking those profits and sucking them out of the companies and cutting all the jobs, and that means there aren't people to report on the struggles of working people. So we think they will give us money. And again, I think if we can get large influencers, big influencers, people who've got a huge pull to come together and push a proper funding pot, we reckon the public will put up money. They, as I said before, the majority of the public don't support the Conservative Party, for instance, the government of the day, and they never have. When they look at polls, they look at, they tend to look at likely to vote or what have you. 40% of the voters voted for the Conservative Party. That makes about 30% of the population. So that's straight off the bat. That's about 70% of people who in this country didn't vote for Conservatives. There's also a lot of dissatisfied people who probably voted for them and regret it. And that's true of any government of the day because of the first past the post system. So we think there must be massive amount of support in the public to get money. And we want to utilize that, but we have to do that together. And we have to do that by going to our own audiences and reaching out beyond our own audiences and mapping again influencers and key spokespeople who are going to help us reach the millions of people that we really need to reach.
And are you using tech? Are you using social media?
currently, but one of the solutions that we were working on and was started as a media fund project a couple of years ago, and it's worth saying for the listeners and viewers what the media fund was, because legally we're still the same organization. The media fund was founded by yours truly here and a couple of renegades who saying, well, we need to solve the funding crisis, and we started up an organization that would raise money and distribute it equally amongst our media partners. Now, we became an association because we weren't effective at raising that money. We were a volunteer organization. We still are. And so, the call to action for people here is, we're doing these things, but we need volunteers and we need your money. Because, and this is quite technical, hard work. So, you might feel like you can't volunteer. You can, trust me, get in touch. Thomas@ima.press. I'll repeat that, Thomas@ima.press, right? Get in touch with us. There will be something that you can do that will be of value. If you've not got any time, you might have some spare money, and that will help us build these things, because we cannot be volunteer network any longer. We weren't able to raise the money. We weren't able to do the things that we wanted to do. But what we did find is there was increased appetite to make these things happen, and we're building a bigger board now. There's more people going to be elected to the board. There's going to be more organizations represented, and there's more effort going in, but it is still for free. We are doing it in our spare time. And ultimately, if you look at any campaign area, any area of problem that we face in the UK, whether it's racism or environmentalism or sexism or any issue of the day, farmer unions, trade negotiations, there's everything from community groups to NGOs, think tanks, political representation in the electoral system, direct action groups. There's everything there. The media doesn't have that. As I said, the reason I was telling you about our history is we're about 5, 6, 7 years old, really, and we're just building these institutions to begin with. Now, as I say, for a couple of years we ran the media fund, but it was volunteers doing their best and getting overwhelmed by life crises and work that we had to do and other things, and we'd get so far with the project and we'd have to quit. We raised money, but we didn't achieve what we wanted to do. We want to this time. The next 6 months is key for all of media. We've got 2 new television stations coming in, but we also believe that we've got support from big people that I can't quite announce quite yet, that are going to do big interventions at the Edinburgh Festival. And we want to be able to announce them to the public, to the wider world, right, this is what you can do, this is what's happening. And we need to build these things now, because if we get another year or 2 down the line, this might be sewn up. So we need people's help. To come back to the technological thing, Bywire was a project set up by the Media Fund, and Bywire has just finished creating its plugin. Again, same problem. Someone who's working full time, doing it in their spare time, over 2 years has developed the code to basically aggregate and put all the best independent media all in one place. And it will be on an app. But what it does more than that is it will allow you to tip or give money to those independent media on the app. So you'll be able to give money directly to the things that you like. You liked an article, tip it. If you liked a publication, give them regular money. Instead of you having to get subscriptions for one organization or another organization or another organization, you can support them all through this app. So we're producing that. Again, we need support on that. We need help. We're going to need a lot of help promoting it. We don't want to just reach the same old. We want millions of people to have this. We want to have more people to have this than the BBC News app. We want this to be the way people get their news, because, as I said, our news is trustworthy, it's financially independent, and the media we support, we only want to grow and be able to fulfill those functions more, and that's what we're going to do through Bywire.
And
Go on.
Oh, sorry, Tom. I had a question when you talked about reaching more people. I had a question about channels used. So we've talked about social media, but what else has been you found at least the most productive way of reaching people? So only talking about my own example for it, just because that's what I know. But in my one of my many careers, one is film programmer, and I found the best way of introducing, I guess, new audiences to documentaries, to certain topics that I felt that were very close to my heart, for example, was to build relationships with youth organisations and schools. That was just an example. And therefore, to get young people to come to screenings and interact directly with filmmakers and around Q&As and so on, and really engage with the discussion around those topics. And I found that very concretely to yield results. And I was wondering, what, in your experience, what's been the best channel? What's been the best way of reaching out beyond the usual suspects?
I don't think it's been done very well, very often, in all honesty. I think it's the least developed part of the independent media. They're focusing on producing content. And if you're looking to produce for an audience who will then donate to you, or you're looking, then that's who you produce for. And you might very well be producing for yourself, which is why, say, a lot of independent media is going to look pretty white, pretty middle class, pretty university educated. So, what you mentioned there is a really good one. I knew a documentary maker who went to all the small trade union branches and did a tour of their documentary around the country to all the small trade union branches locally. And again, generated income, but also a lot of, support and practical action, because people were engaging with like the content and going, well, we've got to do something about this, because they're the kind of people who see something and say, well, I'm going to do something about it. So I think that's a really great thing that I've seen. I think what you've seen in the opposite end of the thing is when you look at, say, the Scottish nationalist independent media, they've ridden a popular wave of interest in Scottish nationalism. Or say, if you look at Novara Media of the Canary, they've ridden a popular wave of interest in Corbynism and sort of left-wing social democracy. So that's a way of reaching new audiences, but I don't think it's a way of getting out of the ordinary. I think in all honesty, that would be a stage 2. Stage 1 is developing what we've got, so it's functional enough so that when we can take it to new audiences, they go, this is slick, it's good, it has the kind of tone that I know and respect. And I don't think we're far away from that, but I don't think off the top of my head, I can't think of many examples right now.
So we've got just a few minutes left until the hour is up. And I thought, to end on a positive note, if you could give us, say, 1 or 2 examples of recent successes by the IMA or the IMA partners, or anything you've seen in terms of a media campaign that's taken off and achieved those goals that the IMA is setting itself.
I think, as I said, we've got the by-wire. The person who was doing this in their spare time has quit their job, fully gone at it, and in the space of weeks got to the point that we wanted to get to. Right, we're producing an app in one place. I think we're producing the Media Democracy Festival, we're working with our partners, the Media Reform Coalition, to do that. That's in the middle of March. It starts with a keynote speech from Jeremy Corbyn on the 14th of March, and that is going to be really worth watching, because there's going to be some announcements there that relate to independent media and how we can build more. I think the foundation of the IMA itself is something that I'm extraordinarily proud of, and I think we can really look at and say we're doing the right thing. We're actually working together, and we're now all on a Slack together. We're all communicating more and more regularly. What we're seeing as well is that a lot of independent media partners, even the big ones who don't necessarily need to interact, are starting to interact with each other and help each other out. And that, I think, is a cause for positivity, because we actually haven't had that during the previous years. It's been very difficult to get people to do it, but they're doing it willingly, and that's really the only way that it can happen. There's a lot of excitement around those things, and as I say, we've got potentially a 6-month program where we're going to be announcing an app. We're going to be announcing sort of reports and maps of influencers, of content creators, of people who are going to amplify our message. We're going to create trainings and best practice for social media. And we have also the other thing that's a really great success is the foundation of Rebel Cities Media. Rebel Cities Media provides donation drive and funding support through utilizing social media, but also email and Telegram and other platforms to generate income for independent media. And that has been actually, for the organizations it's worked with, which is only 3 or 4 at this point, a real success in the space of 6 months. That's going to go from strength to strength. So lots of good things. Finally, this infrastructure is coming together. And now what we could do is this, boost of volunteers and money to take it to the next level and eventually just replace this awful media system that we have now.
Well, let's hope so. That's us. The hour is up. So I assume there'll be a blurb under the podcast link in which we can put all the relevant links and information should you wish to contact us or find out more about the IMA, the IMA's partners, and Tom himself. Thank you very much for listening or viewing the video, and we will see you next month with more guests and more ways to tackle the current media crisis and give us hope for the future. Have a good month. That's us for us.